I interviewed you for the Times about a year and a half ago, right after The Terrorist came out, and I asked you what was next, and you said you weren't quite sure, but you said you had an idea of you could see a plump novel with a lot of characters, sort of like Gosford Park. Instead, you wrote The Widows of Eastwick.
I said that. Yeah, it's kind of plump, and it's not skinny. Right. It's plump enough, I thought.
But it's not really the novel you imagined, or is it?
It probably was not. No, I was just embarrassed to confess to you that I was going to impose another sequel on the world, a world already rich in sequels of mine. But sequels are appealing because you've done a lot of the work already, and have only to try to attach one car to the preceding car. And that was my vision of this sequel, was to make a novel that kind of fitted like bookends into the other. There will be no sequel to it, I promise.
Perhaps for the sake of the few people who don't know, the new book is called The Widows of Eastwick, and it's a sequel to John Updike's sort of famous book, The Witches of Eastwick, which came out 24 years ago. In this case, though, the witches have aged 30 years. They've aged, you've got time going faster than it needs to go.
The novel took place in the late 60s and early 70s. The time of the first novel, Witches, was a little vague. I describe a lugubrious president. It could have been either Johnson or Nixon, but it was the height of the Vietnam protest, and riots of several sorts were in progress, and it was a violent time. And there was a lot of witchcraft in the air, not just suburban women having one too many drink of a Tuesday night, but there was the Manson case, which involved real witchcraft, and there was just a lot of strange and sinister going on in that period. Why it took me so many years to write about that period, I don't know, except that things have to mature and you have to get some kind of handle on them. And I'd moved houses, and somehow the new house, it seemed possible to look back on that time. So, Chip, in all respect to your chronology, I think the two novels take place a little more than 30 years apart, even though they were written, as you say, 25 years apart.
But here's another question, though. Why do the witches have to get old anyway? Witches, can't witches stay young?
Well, if they were really effective witches, no doubt they would not get old. But these are imperfect witches, really part-time witches, who I think witches, in fact, were characteristically elderly. I mean, they were sort of born old. But now these three women, no longer in the same area, but one having moved to New Mexico and one to Massachusetts and one to Connecticut, do slowly get together. I don't know. You know, describing any book, it begins to sound very foolish. But I had this vision of them going back to Eastwick, the city, the small town, the Rhode Island town, where they did their worst mischief and had their witchy fun, to visit the scene of their primes. And of course, that doesn't usually work. It worked to an extent in this case, though, and it was fun for me, if you care about the writer having fun. Fun for me to be with them again, because the triad had that character, the quality that we like in characters, which is that they can talk. They talk to each other, and they have a lot to say, and that fills the page and moves the book along.
To be serious a minute, it is in part a book about aging. I mean, why they get old is because that's what the book is about. It's a book about aging, and it's also about, it seems to me, it's about change in place, even in America. Eastwick itself is a very different place, and in fact, when they come back to it, they're sort of regretful. And they say it's been suburbanized, it's been mauled over. It is a book a little bit about change and about loss.
There is that complaint that the town has gotten very disappointing. I think the most vocal disappointee is the smallest and darkest of the witches, Jane Smart. She was in the other book, and now she's become Jane Tinker. And she says, Eastwick used to be a fun, hick kind of place. and it isn't anymore. And it's true, there are civic improvements and an attempt to beautify the town. It's an old seaside town with things in imperfect repair, and they've strung Christmas lights up into the trees that border the streets, which has happened actually coincidentally in the town where I live. So it's Christmas all year long in Eastwick now, and the curbs are higher, and your car door when it opens gets scuffed and scraped. And yes, the town in some ways has not improved, but in many ways it remains the same town that they knew. The town is meant to be an old Puritan town with memories of Anne Hutchison and other dissidents who found refuge in Rhode Island. And Rhode Island is where the real oddballs and misfits of the colonies came. So it was a raffish kind of place, as I conceived it. And they gather there. And the town has a voice in the book, a dark voice. After the witches have tried to undo some of the evil they did, the voice says, you can't undo evil. Can't undo it, you can't. So it's all silly to try. Remember that?
I went back and reread the original, and I was reminded that when Witches of Eastwick came out, it was sort of controversial at the time, and you were criticized for being misogynistic or anti-feministic. And reading the book now, I wonder what was all that about. It seems if anything, sort of worshipful.
It's a loving book about women, about witchy women. Yes, I didn't quite understand it at the time, but I was a younger writer then and quite anxious to do the correct thing. And if I was being misogynistic, I felt repentant about that. And I'd been accused for some time. I, who had a very clever mother and grew up in the shade of intelligent, ambitious women all around me. I thought I was a great admirer of them and a supporter of some. And to be accused of being anti-female or anti-feminist, I guess would be more precise. I guess it hurt me. I couldn't see that I had trespassed in any meaningful way. And now you say the rereading didn't reveal much of this to your eye, but then you're a male and maybe misogynistic yourself. Yeah, the book was an attempt, sort of a tongue-in-cheek attempt to put women at the center of the plot instead of making them merely accessories to the hero's needs and irritations, and to make them professional in the sense that each one is devoted to one of the arts, and they are all divorced and have turned their husbands, their ex-husbands, into relics of the past.
A placemat.
One is a placemat. One becomes all dried out and hung in the cellar to sprinkle into certain compounds to make it a sort of way out, maybe. But yes, so this is my attempt to placate my female critics, and I don't think it worked. I think they remained ever more convinced that I was the wrong sort. And I don't know what I can do to please them. Other reviewers said that this was a very loving book and it is true that I loved being in the book with them. I loved being party to their gossip sessions and even their sessions of malice. I enjoyed being malicious through them, not being myself malicious in any way. So yeah, it was meant well, but then all of one's books are kind of meant well, and not all convince everybody. But yeah, it had a movie made of it, I suppose. One of the
So that was my next question. What did you make of that?
Well, it's the only book of mine that ever had a successful movie based upon it. And the movie had an all-star cast: Jack Nicholson, some of you who saw it may remember Cher, Susan Sarandon, and Michelle Pfeiffer, who were all excellent, especially Michelle Pfeiffer. And she was the one character who actually was improved in the movie over the character in the book. But the movie itself avoided the crux of the novel, which was that these three witches, when joined by a younger apprentice witch, found that she was walking away with the magnetic Darrell Van Horn, who's the diabolical central instigator and sponsor of their witchcraft. They cast a spell upon her and killed her, after having really killed her parents too. So there's a certain amount of mayhem in the novel which was left out of the movie. The movie couldn't or didn't want to cope with it, and that kind of led me, I think, to try to remind readers in this sequel of what had happened in the first book.
Does it seem odd to you, or is it a matter of indifference that so few of your books have been made into movies? I would have thought, for example, that Couples would have been a natural.
Couples was the one one book I really thought could make a movie. And a man called David Walper of Hollywood thought so too, because he bought the rights to it. And I had a conference, Bennett Cerf arranged it, and I met a few Hollywood noblemen. But in the end, I decided that my book, the movie never appeared. And even though I could see scenes of it, sort of in a blue filters, and I saw it as a blue movie in a literal way somehow, because the novel was meant to be a sort of fairy tale of suburban togetherness, leading to a reorganization of the couples, but becoming another couple. It was about a very, I suppose, early 60s kind of defiance, a quiet revolution whereby middle-class Americans with no great loyalty to the nation as such, or love of their work, or belief in any religious creed, made a kind of tribe or a circle of each other. My first attempt to write about it, sort of a clan, more than a clan, an actual, so that the only thing interesting was the other people in this circle. And it's true that they slept with each other somewhat, but they also played games together and kind of raised children in a loose way together, and did a lot of things together, and found in each other a comfort and an entertainment that society was not otherwise providing. I thought that Foxy Whitman, the heroine, could have been played by Faye Dunaway, and I saw Steve McQueen as the hero, who's sort of a stocky contractor who moves around a lot. That's one advantage contractors have over, say, accountants, is that their truck can be almost anywhere in town. Yeah, the movie never forthcame, and I had the money. I was all right. Maybe it saved me an embarrassment, simplified my life not to have this movie, and yet I felt a certain pang. And I decided that just spending one night with the Hollywood people, I realized that my book was written by a very sexually naive person. And that, to me, sex was kind of astounding and menacing and mysterious, and to them, it was the coin of the realm. It was they lived it, they acted it, they did it, they knew all about it, and that my book must have seemed, when it got actually to a scriptwriter, hopelessly naive and empty. I don't feel that about the book, but I think they might have. So all of my books, Chip, probably wind up the same way, even the ones upon which an option has been taken. They resist adaptation into the smooth plots that Hollywood movies provide. There's always an element of ambiguity, and I depend heavily, perhaps, upon the writing itself, the conjuration of scenes and faces and encounters through the words, and that without the words, there isn't much left.
Just one more question about Couples, and we'll move on. Couples was remarkable for a number of things you sort of alluded to, and one was its at the time groundbreaking sexual frankness, and this was something, in fact, that you were known for a while. You were a literary writer, certainly, but you're also much more daring, much more realistic than writers of a literary sort had ever been. Now it seems funny to look back. I think some of what you were doing by today's standards seems tame, but yet at the time it was revolutionary. And I'm curious as to whether that did that seem bold to you at the time, or was that
Couples came out in '68. Does that sound right?
Yeah.
And Portnoy's Complaint came out in '69, and Lolita had come out in the early '60s, if not about 19. So I wasn't alone in trying to push this particular frontier. It just seemed to me that yes, we should recognize sex as not something that happened when the novelist closed the door, as Tolstoy does. Tolstoy certainly convinces us that his people have sexual lives, and they have fleshly existence, tremendously so. But he doesn't talk about the actual sexual events. And I thought that was something maybe that what was left of modernism might try to do. D.H. Lawrence, of course, attempted it and did, not more than attempted, he actually did it in Lady Chatterley and James Joyce in the last chapter of Ulysses. So I was not really quite a pioneer, but I was trying to show sex as on the continuum of human experience. My mother once told me, Johnny, you don't write about sex as if it's something that people just do, or something. I forget. Maybe I'm misquoting her. But yeah, I thought that betrayed and told me about something kind of innocent in me that couldn't accept it as just something that people do. But I did, and Rabbit Run to the point where Alfred A. Knopf had to call in a lawyer to minimize what the lawyer called contact. So he and I sat side by side at this table, really almost touching elbows, looking at various passages and trying to minimize contact. And what he wanted taken out, oddly enough, wasn't what I would have taken out. So I was grateful, and I wanted to see the book published. I didn't think I'd get a better deal from Barney Rossett at Grove Press or anybody, and so I submitted to the censorship, and not long after it became silly, and I reinserted the racy bits back in the text. Couples was written under no such shadow of Southern sheriffs arresting us. Alfred did have an authentic vision of a Southern sheriff showing up on Madison Avenue and taking him away. It didn't happen. And Couples, yeah, but my sense of it was that this is, in some ways, a Midsummer Night's Dream. That Couples is, a Never Never Land of a kind, and so that the sex is not just explicit, it's also magical and kind of funny. The first, as I remember the book, the first sex scene of any extent occurs when a suburban couple makes love on a pile of wash, of clean wash. Yeah, and people, I don't know, the book was very good to me and sold well. The only time I've ever been at the top of the bestseller list, although briefly, a Burley book called Airport by Arthur Haley upended me and kicked me off. But I had been up there knowing the heights. So I was always grateful to Couples, and it was, Chip, you may remember, the critical establishment of the time was not crazy about that book. No, they thought it was whatever, gauche or too much or overwritten or whatever. But it was a heartfelt book, and I thought I was saying something about the American family, American community at that time and place.
Presumably, in order to write Widows, you had to go back and reread Witches, and I'm curious, what is it like to reread yourself? Do you look at passages and say, "Wow, I did that," or and then other ones you say, "Ooh," do you wince? What is it? Or is it both?
I blush to say that I don't wince much. Maybe Maybe I should, but I was impressed by how much stuff there was and how much energy of a kind there was. I did a good deal of research to write Witches in witchcraft, so there was a lot of authentic lore, certain details. The one of the, those of you who read the book, of the feathers and pins coming out of people's mouths when they try to talk was actually detailed in the Scots trial of witches in the 1600s. So I had a lot, and I was full of the community too, and the sense of community which is in that book. When I reread it, I made an index trying to pick up details that I could use again and get the streets straight and the characters' hair color, all these details need to match up as best I can. But I felt that the second book would have to be paler, that I couldn't give it that kind of energy and investment of feeling that the first book had. Not that I thought that it would be another kind of book. It would be a more a lighter book. And it's not especially light, as you know. There nasty things happen in it too. But basically, it's it bears the same relation to witches as old age does to one's physical prime. You're still here in the body, but it's a paler sort of here-ness.
I believe when you took the 4 rabbit books and put them into the Everyman, you made adjustments. I think some of them were factual, but maybe there were more. And I think I'm right that when you collected the early stories, you made a few adjustments. I mean, is that a temptation to a writer to want to revise yourself? Henry James, went overboard in this direction.
He went overboard, famously overboard, and did not probably improve, so that the book is now printed in both the versions, right? And professors have the dilemma of to assign which version. My revisions are not of that order. But of course, when a book is reset and put in type again, you try to reread the text with care, and if you see any obvious improvements, you make them. And I don't understand writers who don't have enough caring or hope of improvement to actually do that. But the changes are not major. Rabbit Run was written with some speed and typed up with even more speed. And maybe it's fitting that it was done rapidly, but there was always a certain carelessness about the writing. And in a way that was part of its virtue too, was that the present tense moved right along by a young writer who had never written a full-length novel before. For me, it was a wonderful ride, and I felt the present tense carrying me somehow. Suddenly I was liberated from the past tense, or worrying about the past, or the pluperfect rabbit lived only in the present, like a character in a movie. And indeed, the book was subtitled originally A Movie, because I wanted to give that same sense of a present tense that we get in a movie. This is happening now right in front of us. And so that text needed adjustment every time it was reset. And my wife, who's in the audience, was horrified when she saw me revising Rabbit Run down in we were in Florida, lying on the beach, groggy and trying to fix Rabbit Run. And she said, "No, you don't have the right to change that now." And I said, "Well, who but me has the right?" So I have tried to improve it and straighten out some very rough and amateurish pieces of it, and likewise in the other rabbits. Although the changes are not what I would call Jamesian in their size. James really reinvented himself as a writer between writing the American and revising it, and so you get. Is that my fault? So that you get these very extensive ornamentations of the original text. And I would hope to have enough sense not to do that. And I don't think that my later novels or short stories really invite much of that kind of revision.
Are there things that you could do as a young writer that are harder for you to do now? And conversely, are there things as an older writer that you can do that you couldn't do when you were young?
Youth has the advantage of innocence and daring, in a way. When I reread the early things, I see some naivetes, verbal gaucheries, but there's also an unfeigned belief that this is very worth telling. And that's really among the blessings that a writer can enjoy. Certainly one indispensable one is the belief that he has something to convey, and that his experience, however transmuted into fiction, is news in some sense. No two generations are alike in a technological world in which just the machinery we handle varies from one generation to the next. So we don't think like our fathers, and our children don't think like us. And there's a moment when you're young, when you're in your 20s perhaps, or even 30s, when you can be the voice or a voice of a generation. And as you age, I think you lose that sense of urgency or of innocent. You know, the way a child will tell you its day. So a young writer will tell you his day, kind of. And the older you get, the less you have of that belief that what you're going to say is very worth saying and needs to be said.
And yet you're still at it. I mean, one of the things that's interesting is that American writers, major American writers, tend to burn out. And you have not. You have been a writer for 50 years. Does it get easier? Do you still get a kick out of it? Is it?
The short answer is, of course, yes. And I realize that I'm getting pretty long in the tooth for this, and that not too many American writers were producing at my age. Most were dead. Most were dead. I think we're all, in this day and age, the 21st century, we're all stuck with a few more years of life than our parents had, or that we really expected to get. I remember, born in 1932, I used to wonder if I would live to see the year 2000, because that would have made me 68, which was about the average male life expectancy back in the Depression. And so when the year 2000 came, and I was still here and in it, and I was slightly discomfited. What now? What do I do? And now we're even deeper into the 21st century, and I'm still trying to write. It gets to be a habit, you know. It's all I've done really for most of my adult life. I became a professional writer early, and it's in a way strange way to make a living. My belief was, as a boy, in the shadow of the great writers of my boyhood, Hemingway and Faulkner and Steinbeck, Perlbuck, Thornton Wilder, there was a stature that these people had that indicated that there was a career here if you worked hard and weren't easily discouraged, that you could become a writer like they. And I wonder how many young people now feel that. I just got through the door in time, is my feeling. I began to write when the Slicks, Colliers, and the Post were still running short stories, and when the New Yorker used to run 2 or 3 an issue, when there was a real market for short fiction. And now the market is just a shadow of that. And I supported myself with short stories for a number of years, really until Couples. So anyway, I'm a relic. I'm a relic in that sense of a vanished world in which, you know, this is a big country and it's a rich country. Why can't it support a few writers? But in fact, it's also not really a reading country. There may be pockets of readership in it, but it's not like Sweden or even England, where people read a lot. The climate doesn't conduce to it. We have a sunny, outdoor kind of climate, and we're hard-working people who really believe in physical work to a degree. So for a number of reasons, yeah, it's hard to find too many freelance writers who can survive comfortably. Does that answer your question, or was your question something else?
No,
I forget.
That's a very good answer, but it leads me to ask, since you brought it up, to press the short story issue a little further, in that, again, among American writers, there are very few who do both, who write short stories and write novels with equal ability, seemingly. And the writers at your level, Bellow wrote only a handful of stories. Roth wrote one volume and then stopped. And yet you persist. Is it that you have this loyalty to the form, or that the form has a loyalty to you?
Loyal. I think I enjoyed doing it. That it's halfway between the flash of a poem, which you can write in less than an hour, and the novel, which generally takes more or less a year. So the short story can be done in a week or 10 days, and in that way is satisfying for somebody who likes a little interaction with the world of print. Many in the generation ahead of me, like Styron and Bellow, were content to spend years on one massive novel and have it come out to universal praise, and then retreat again, and 5 years later come up with another. And I don't think I have that capacity to hold my breath that long. I like to see things in print. I enjoy, to some extent, reader reaction. I like to feel that I'm in some sense a citizen of New York City, even though I left here over 50 years ago. And the short story is a way to keep in touch with the exciting world of magazine. I love magazines. The kind of town, American town I lived in, the magazines on the drugstore rack were really the chief emissaries of a culture. It wasn't a high culture much, but it was culture, and there was a gloss to them and an excitement. And the cartoons, everything, the ads, it all spoke of a wider world which I wanted to enter. And so maybe for that reason I continue to write short stories. I don't really have the old knack, or maybe it's gotten harder to write the good short stories. But I still persevere. And yes, you're right. I did get a couple in the New Yorker lately, and I'm always happy now, because now I, who was once young in those ranks of the writers and editors, am now become older than the editors, older than most of the other contributors, and that I'm insofar as I have a lust for life, I want to manifest it in appearing in print.
Do you think the short stories have changed because of, there are many few of them obviously, but because of as you say, the drying up or the ceasing to publish of magazines? Have you described your own short stories once very beautifully? You called your project "Giving the Mundane Its Beautiful Due," which seemed to me a quite eloquent formulation of what you do. It seems to me that short stories, or a lot of them, don't do that anymore. They don't see that as their task.
I think the New Yorker has become, and really has been for many decades, the main venue for short stories, and the fact that they only run one an issue has made them more ambitious, each one, and they tend to be longer than the average story with Ross or Sean used to be, and so that they sort of a sense of, oh, we've got to make this really good, really big in some way, which maybe isn't the best approach for a short story. They do still run some that are small, but the quickness that you feel in John O'Hara, say, a master of an outmoded form of short story is gone. And in an increasingly global world, I have the impression that the editors are more receptive now to not just European writers, but third world writers. You see Africans, Asians in the New Yorker, and so there's only so much room for a member of the American bourgeoisie who's still trying to describe how Sunday feels. And I kind of miss that Americanness, because the short stories notoriously were an American specialty, something about our temperament or the market of the time led a number of our greatest writers to be short story writers, Hawthorne, Henry James. Melville was not a bad short story writer when he stooped to the medium. There have been many very distinguished ones who have found something congenial about this brief form, and there is a way of capturing the problem for a writer who hasn't been to war or really suffered any significant trauma is how to make interesting the mundane stuff, the quotidian, the day that most of us live, the day when nothing extraordinary happens. And I think there's less interest in doing that, in illuminating the average or the anonymous in a way that enlightens all of us. Cheever had a wonderful way of illuminating ordinary doings in an American suburb, so that they seemed rich in supernatural glow somehow came through. And I think short stories. Some of them are obviously very good, and we need to read stories about India and Africa. We need to know how the vast majority of other people live. But something provincial and precious maybe has been lost out of the most short stories.
Speaking of sequels, which we were a few minutes ago, do you ever regret knocking off Rabbit at the ridiculously young age of, 56?
He was 56, but he was overweight, and he'd had, in a way, a hard life. When my father was falling ill, the doctor told my mother and myself, your father has an athlete's heart. He had played football and baseball, and his heart was enlarged. And so I think I felt that Rabbit, too, would have an athlete's heart. And men do drop over at 56, so fewer and fewer. It was entirely selfish. I felt I had stumbled upon a good thing with this character in this environment, which was basically my boyhood environment. The Pennsylvanianness of it all there's a geniality and a warmth that comes through somehow from that Commonwealth that I could draw upon, and hence deciding to move on beyond Rabbit Run, age him a decade, and then another decade, and then another decade. I felt I was doing something that I hadn't done before, and that in a way I was capturing a male American life in these segments. But he was not a comic strip character. He was a mortal man, the image of a mortal man, and so you can't have him just go on and on like Mandrake the Magician. There has to be a death. He has to die before me, because only I can kill him. And I thought I better do it while I was still ahead of the game. That one more fat novel about Rabbit would have only added to the same sort of trouble he already was having with his family. The boy, his war with Nelson, you could say, which animates the whole sequel, his war with his son who's 2, then 12, then 22, and then 32. The love and irritation, infuriating relationship there, which is yet the most important, really, in Rabbit's life, was the central element. And to have Nelson be 42 and Rabbit be 66, I couldn't see any aesthetic profit or informational profit in that. So yes, it wasn't killing him. It felt good in a way. I didn't think it would, but you need to have a sense as a writer of an ending as well as a beginning, and so that he would die around a basketball backboard as you first saw him, and that he would feel that he was winning this little game of pickup seemed a nice way to go. He is a Swede. His name's Angstrom, which means a little tiny something. And There are images of Viking mythology in the retirement home or whatever it is, assisted living. I don't know what it is. It's just the place he winds up in Florida is full of Viking imagery, and the notion of his Viking blood leading him to die in a kind of fit of going berserk. Berserk was a tactic whereby the Vikings made themselves irresistible as warriors. All that seemed to me to fit. I was nagged enough by having lost my best friend in fiction that I did write a sequel in which his ghost haunts his two surviving children who finally get to meet. So I thought that was a sequel that did no harm to Rabbit himself, but maybe wound up a few loose ends that the series as a whole had not tied up before.
When I was thinking about this evening, I was thinking how, besides Rabbit's great appeal as a character, how great a vehicle he was for kind of learning about America. And, you know, one of the great things about Rabbit was that he was such an enthusiast in his way. He was such a patriot. And I remember in one of the books, he says, and I'll censor it slightly, he talks about how America is the happiest country in the history of the world. And then I found myself thinking, I wonder what Rabbit would have made of America after 2001. And then I thought, and then I had the happier thought, I decided I think that Rabbit would probably be very interested in Sarah Palin. Don't you think?
I think he would be very drawn to Sarah Palin. A vice president who excites sexual feelings. We've never had that before, have we? At least not in the last century. So yeah, I think he would have a lot to say, something to say about Sarah Palin. Probably rude, but yeah, she's a force in a strange way, and would attract Rabbit's attention. When I wrote Rabbit Run, I described him running away from his home and his community, and turning on the radio and getting a page full of news of that time. And I remember I turned on the radio that night, what I thought was the right night, it's in March, I think, and wrote down what was happening in the world. So with that little vignette there, then he became whenever he gets in a car, he turns on the radio and the news of the time comes through, and he reflects upon it or reacts to it in some way. And so he became willy-nilly, he became a bearer of the headlines of the times as they go by. And this was sort of unintended, but became a useful way to write. And yes, he is generally interested. He has feelings, positive feelings about America. That doesn't express them very well, and it takes the form really of feeling sorry for every president, or willing to sympathize with every president, and willing to take a pro-Vietnam stand, and probably, had he been alive, a pro-Iraq position. He was himself a soldier, did not, I believe, serve in Korea, but he was of that age, and so yeah, that's the way he was. He felt himself as an American, and you wonder how many people see themselves as Americans with that kind of pride now.
You mentioned earlier about growing up in Pennsylvania, and it seems to me that in Shillington, Pennsylvania, where you grew up, or Olinger, as it's been recast, it turns out to have been an inestimable piece of writerly capital. It's something that you've been able to go back to again and again and again. It's not given to every writer, or is it? Is it what you make?
I think people move around. The average person often they don't have any home state. They have no state, no city they can call their own. They move around, following their father's employment career. And yeah, I was a child of an earlier era where you more or less stayed put. A lot of my school classmates are still staying put. I go back and they're still there in Berks County. It's a relatively conservative part of the country. And in a way it was fortunate because you get, as Faulkner demonstrated, you get a sense of the layers of past that exist in any community where you just stay put and get a real feeling, deep feeling for the place and its personnel. I was moved away from the suburb of Shillington. And we lived in a big white house belonging to my grandfather and grandmother. And so I was in exile. I was a tiny exile. We moved to a farm 10 miles away. And it isolated my childhood, so that, up to 13, I was such and such a person. And then I became somebody else. I became a beginning of an exile. My mother, I think, thought that Shillington was a stifling environment full of small-minded people, and that it would do me good, as well as herself good, to get out of it. And so I think she was correct, but I resented it, and still, to a degree, resent it. The farm was wonderful, really, 80 acres, and you couldn't see another house light from our house. Half the farmhouses hadn't been electrified yet. It was really a step way back into the American past, and in that sense, an illumination. And I grew and became strong from doing farm chores. So it was a good thing, but it did turn Shillington into a kind of a false paradise. And when I go back to Shillington, which I do rarely now, I still get very excited. I think this is the place. This is where everything matters.
Is Shillington still Shillington, though, or has it, like Eastwick, become suburbanized or mallified?
Yeah, it's blended into the surrounding towns. When I was there, it was surrounded by cornfields. I mean, there was a distinct place where Shillington ended, and now it's blended into Kenhorst and Adamstown, and it's one more. It's a little like New Jersey, where you move from town to town without there being an interval. But no, we had a sense of identity and even a kind of pride. Shillington was clearly the best place to be from, and the misery of being from, say, Moulton was just up the line on the trolley tracks, but that was a deplorable fate that one wouldn't wish on a dog. So this kind of provincial identity was part of Shillington's ethos, and now it's gone. Where the old poorhouse grounds used to be, and the inspiration of my first novel, there's an extensive mall in development, and yeah, it's been mallized. Nevertheless, the middle of it was built solidly in the 20s and 30s of brick row houses, or semi-detached houses in rows, and because of their tight-built nature, they haven't changed. So you go back to Shillington and you do find territories where you remember it looks exactly the same, and a lot of towns you can't find any spot that looks exactly the same, but Shillington does have enough to feed an elderly natives returning nostalgia.
The other place on which you've drawn a great deal of writerly capital, it seems to me, is New England. And as a young man, you made a kind of interesting, and I think probably in retrospect, crucial decision. You had graduated from Harvard, you studied for a year in England, you came back and you took a job at the New Yorker, and you were writing talk of the town pieces, and I guess also writing verse and perhaps selling fiction. And then I believe you had a child, and we were talking backstage. You lived first on the Upper West Side, and then you lived down in the Village. And you were leading the life that countless American would-be writers, would-be artists lived. And then at a certain point, you pulled the plug on it, and you moved to Ipswich, Massachusetts, which in those days was nowhere.
On the edge of nowhere, certainly. It was an inspiration, and I think it was a good thing to do, and a healthy thing to do. It came upon me quite suddenly. I had a second child, so suddenly our apartment down on West 13th Street was clearly too small. We were managing with one child, carry the crib back, and we only had 2 rooms. It was a floor through, and had the village charms. The village was a more innocent place then than it's become, but yeah, it wasn't a bad life, and I've always wanted to live in New York, and I always wanted to work for the New Yorkers, so you'd think I would have been very content with that, but I felt that basically the New York had too many other writers or people in the writing trade in it that I felt crowded.
Were you part of that? Were you part of a writer's crowd back then?
Very small, really. A few old college friends who had literary aspirations, and some of my younger New Yorker colleagues. So I had some friends. I certainly did not partake of, say, the abstract expressionists who were having fun a few blocks away at the
Cedar Tavern.
The Cedar Tavern. So I was sort of oblivious of the real cultural ferment going on around me. I was a commuter up to the New Yorker and back, and as you say, I tried to mix freelance contributions with my talk of the town. But a number of factors played into it, which maybe you don't need to hear. One was I thought I wasn't going to get any better at writing talk of the town pieces, that I'd had 2 fun years of doing them, but a lifetime of doing them sort of dismayed me. I felt I had something to say, something Pennsylvanian to say, and I needed to get away from this particular seductive hurly-burly. And so I settled on Ipswich. My wife then was a New Englander, and she didn't have many friends and was sort of stuck with the kids in the apartment all the time, not conspicuously happy, and I thought a small town would suit us all better. And Ipswich was, as you say, kind of beyond Boston. It wasn't Connecticut. I felt that Connecticut or northern New Jersey had the same disadvantages of New York City. Too many bright, competitive people. Living too expensively for me. And so yeah, I moved experimentally to see if I could hack it for a couple of years and maybe write a few sell the New Yorker a few short stories. And it worked out. It worked out. But it worked out in part because our standard of living was much lower than living even modestly in New York.
And yet, I mean, it's curious that you made your living in the beginning by writing short stories for the New Yorker. And what's interesting to me is an Updike of today couldn't do that. An Updike of today would probably have to teach. I mean, which is the New Yorker saved you from that.
The New Yorker pays good rates, but somehow the dollar doesn't go far enough anymore. Yeah, in those days...
but you couldn't, also, a young writer couldn't sell enough stories to the New Yorker. They don't
That's
publish
right.
that.
You could not. You could not. And in those days, $1,000 for a short story was really quite a lot of money. I made more money than my neighbors did, and that, I think, is what really matters in your sense of well-being. If you're making a little more money than your neighbor, then you're well off, and if you're not, you're miserable. And the New Yorker, I think they had a quota. As you say, they published many. They published 2 or 3 an issue. If you sold them 6, they would give you a bonus for quantity. And in this way, they tried to temper the wind to the shorn lambs of the freelance writers dotted out there. They were good to me. I think they took enough to keep me in the game, as it were. I can't imagine my life without the New Yorker's acceptance of my writing and their patronage, in a way.
I interviewed Norman Mailer a few months before he died, and he said a number of things that surprised me, but the one that surprised me the most was that this man who, for most of his life, had been so concerned about his literary reputation, who I think got up every morning and measured his literary stock, not only against his contemporaries, but against Tolstoy and Hemingway and so on. At the end of his life, he kind of had ceased to care. And he also said that he had no idea what his reputation would be. He thought it would depend in part on chance, and that it might not have anything to do with merit or not. So I'm curious about you at the end or toward the end of a career. Do you think about posterity? Does that cross your mind? How will your work last? Which of them will? Does that ever cross your mind?
Oh, sure. You go into it as a way of living longer. You go into it as one form of immortality that you might get. And certainly any art, the attraction of it is, in a way, the product moves beyond you, moves out of your house, gets spread around the world to some degree. All that is very soothing to the anxious ego. fearful of extinction. So, of course, but on the other hand, Mailer was probably being wise when he didn't push it at the end, when he realized that it's out of his control, and literary reputations are very strange things. There was a whole raft of poets contemporary with Emily Dickinson. None of them would have imagined that she would become one of the flaming names of American letters. Melville, who died, he was pretty poor, and he had a succession of humiliating failures, and now he is another one of the great names. So, who's going to be chosen to be a great name is a little out of your control, because you don't really know what the future will want to read. We are more tolerant of eccentricity and strangeness, whether it's Melville's or Emily Dickinson's, much more tolerant of it than the 19th century was. They wanted order, they wanted meter, they wanted conventional plots, they wanted good to triumph over evil, they wanted all kinds of things which to us moderns, postmoderns maybe, don't matter. So who knows what qualities they will find discardable. There also is the real threat that reading of any sort will become increasingly obsolete, and that these piles of books that all of us writers are piling up will become just as burdensome as Latin writing in the Renaissance. There was a lot of that, and who now reads it except a few scholars. So yes, it's not something you should stay awake at night about. You should, my theory is, you should do your best, try to be honest in your work and amusing. You have a duty to entertain, Henry James, I think, said, and you also have a duty to try to be truthful, both in the larger and the smaller details you deal with. And beyond that, it is out of your control.
I think if those of us in this room had to bet who would last, you'd put your money on Bellow, Updike, and Roth. And it's curious that those last two, Updike and Roth, are almost exactly the same age. And you seem every year to just be pacing one another. He has a book, you have a book. Is that something you're aware of? Does that spur you on? Is this...
Yeah, I think to a degree. If Philip didn't exist, I'd probably be a lazier, more complacent person, even more complacent. Yeah, I think Philip's and his late flowering, this sudden burst of a book a year. He used to be like Bellow. You'd only get a little Roth now and then, and he had various difficulties to work through, and you would not have thought of him as a prolific writer, really, until the last decade or so. So, yeah, he's taken on a burst of great energy while continuing to write, mostly about the futility of it all and the certainty of death. And but, yeah, he's hot. He's hot. Bellow was so much the best American writer for so long that you sort of just grew up under his umbrella in a funny way. You conceded that Bellow had a magic and a power that couldn't be matched, and an Americanness, a love of America, a love of ideas too. Anyway, Bellow, although I envied him his gifts, yet I took some comfort in hiding behind him in a way. Now he's not there to hide behind. But yeah, he was a wonderful writer. There were many others, of course, and as I say, you don't know who's going to be chosen to be read by the next generation, let alone the next century.
Are there younger writers whom you pay attention to? Do you try? I know you review a great deal, but do you try to keep up on not just the things that you're assigned? Is this...
Probably not as much as I should. It's assumed that I'm like any manufacturer, keeping close tabs on what my rivals are turning out. But the fact is that I read younger writers only when I'm told to review one. But even there, I have reviewed a number of them, and they're all, to a man and woman, they're gifted and they can do things that I can't do. And there's a lot of energy out there, actually. You wouldn't think that an age which makes writing as a career so difficult and so unlikely would attract writers like Michael Chabon and who's that English writer? I've forgotten it. I had it on my mind. Vicky or something. Anyway, there are a lot of writers, and the kind of energy that that those who haven't had a literary voice until now, the Hispanics in this country and elsewhere, the brown immigrants to England, they all have plenty to say. They have what I've just described about the feeling that this hasn't been said before or expressed, and that they're really speaking not just for themselves, but through themselves, speaking about a whole mass of people. Now, in high terms of literature, great skill, and as I say, lovely energy, and even a new kind of language, a new way of dealing with the language. So I know they're out there, and I do kind of read them sometimes, but I'm past the age when you can really be smitten by a writer to the extent that you want to imitate them, and that you actually learn a new way to write. I had that with Proust when I read him in English. I had that with Henry Green. I had it with John Cheever to a degree. People who really showed me the way to unpack my own bag.
Do you reread those? Do you reread Proust? Do you reread Nabokov, or are you saving those for later?
I did read a lot of Nabokov, and have had occasion to look into him again. You're struck now by the astonishing verbal cleverness and beauty of his cleverness, and also this chess puzzle kind of mind he had. But you're also irritated by the above it all quality that Nabokov had. I recently have been rereading Cheever because I'm supposed to review a biography, a very compendious biography of him that's going to appear in a couple months, and so I've been trying to reread some Cheever with a good deal of admiration. His ability to project the old values, or to mourn for the loss of the old values in fiction, and the ability to turn a New York suburb into a place of enchantment and real spiritual activity in the way that the angels in heaven might have a spiritual activity is quite wonderful, and a rare talent.
The other thing that Mailer said to me was that he felt that his profession had become almost antiquated. He compared himself to a coachmaker in an era when everybody was driving cars. And I thought he went almost so far as to say that if he had it to do over again, he might have been a filmmaker. I wonder if you've ever had second thought.
Well, I think if Miller had watched his own films, he might have changed his mind. But a pity in a way. But philosophical. It's right for an old man, especially one who was as ailing as Norman was, that he be philosophical and sort of downgrading his thing. But I was thinking the other day that there is no Norman Mailer now to cover these political conventions. What would he have made of Sarah Palin and the Obama emergence and the McCain, not exactly an emergence, but performance. I miss him in a way because he did bring a degree of passion and intelligence and verbal verve of a high order to the political scene. And although we read constantly, especially in the last year, about political matters, I mean, we're saturated with it. There's nobody I know of who can really bring to it a kind of distinction, making these people in some way epic. Mailer did have that gift in his journalism of making things seem vivid and important. So I'm sorry if he doubted his verbal power, because he had a fair amount of it.
I think we're supposed to take some questions now, and those of you who want to ask questions need to go out, I think, into the aisle, and there are microphones. There's a problem in that I can't, from here, can't see you.
There we go.
That's a little better, yeah.
The house lights are up. There's one mic there, and one mic there, and there's a gentleman standing right at that mic.
Speaking of posterity, I especially loved your memoirs, Self-Consciousness, and I think maybe 50, 100 years from now that people might refer to those memoirs. But they also reminded me, because it's suburban, but there's this artist, Eric Fischel, who's done paintings on suburban childhoods. And I've noticed in the New York Review of Books, you do review art. I don't know if you plan to review some of his art. But my question really is, compared to Shillington, how would you compare the pros and cons of children growing in suburban America after World War II, and maybe even in this century, compared to the rich childhood that you described so well in your memoirs of Shillington?
As I say, I had a more centered life in that the Depression and World War II effectively froze Shillington. It didn't change. A vacant lot stayed vacant all the time I was there until 45, when the world slowly began to move again. So it was sort of an unusual circumstance. You asked me about children now. My feeling is that Spielberg's
particularly
film,
suburban children.
Yeah, suburban, but Spielberg's suburbia, the California suburbia that he remembers or evokes, is not physically at all like the arboreal Pennsylvania Dutch small town that I grew up in, but yet he conveys through his movies an enchantment there too. I think that childhood is intrinsically enchanting wherever you have it, unless you're starving or beaten by your parents every night. But the child has the ability to suck wonder and beauty and excitement out of the world. Almost anywhere they're put down in a relatively healthy and stable place. So Shillington just happened to be my place, but I'm not sure. You know, there are lots of other places.
Would you say, talking about the enchantment of childhood, would this be true of, let's say, the children of the three witches, or say the children of the couples in Couples? I mean, one of the things that's interesting in those books is there's a certain degree of parental neglect. These children are, or by today's standards anyway, they seem somewhat
neglected
or sacrificed to the ambitions and lusts of the parents.
Exactly. Well, yes, they are. Witches were, one of the things about witches was they were considered the enemies of children. And if you remember, the Salem witches were brought to trial because of children, young girls screaming and saying these people were doing them harm. So there is a kind of a war between witches and children, just as there is a kind of a war perhaps between the claims of motherhood and the claims of any kind of profession. To some extent, yes. Once there's a novel by Peter Taylor in which the child complains of the way the father treated him growing up and left him, I guess. I don't know. But he says that we don't want your parent to be a dummy that only serves your wishes. You want your parent to be an independent adult that you can emulate in some deep way. So I'm not sure a little benign neglect is entirely bad for children. I was raised a typical child of my era, an only child because children were expensive in the Depression. People didn't have more than they had to. Living with not just 2 but 4 adults. And I was much watched after and protected and I guess encouraged and cherished and admired. And, I was made to feel my little drawings were somehow marvelous. And I think Roth had the same kind of childhood, although he did have a brother. But yeah, we were spoiled and pampered. And our parents gave us the impression that they were devoting basically most of their lives to our welfare. Not their own, but to us. And now I think the present generation, much the same thing is happening. The parents are more protective, more involved. And my generation, on the other hand, having been so protected by our parents, felt their attention oppressive and didn't inflict it on our children. We let them, within limits, grow wild, and didn't lay down too many rules. I don't know how apologetic I should be for that. It was a difference, and we are now in another era where, for different reasons, protectiveness, these parents are really focused. But is it entirely healthy to try to live through your children? I think it puts a burden on them that they might, crack under sometimes. Maybe there's no foolproof way to raise children, in fact. Maybe any way you do it is apt to be wrong. Larkin wrote that short poem, say, your mom and dad, they fuck you up. They don't mean to, but they do. Yes.
My question is addressed to the two of you, really, maybe particularly Mr. McGrath, in that you worked together for so many years. What was it like editing Mr. Updike? I mean, did your contributor behave himself?
Yeah, he certainly did. First of all, I should say that I didn't edit Mr. Updike all that often. I usually did it and I would stand in when either the two editors, William Maxwell and then Roger Angell, were away. My experience, I used to learn from watching John work. He was a sort of a self-cleaning oven. He was his own best editor. And the other thing that I used to marvel at was that you would ask him a question. In those days, we did it less by phone sometimes than by proofs, and I'd sort of pencil something in the margin of a proof and I'd send it off and it would come back. And there'd be a question or I might indicate, well, a word repetition, whatever. John would invariably improve it. Every opportunity that was given him became an opportunity to make things better. Most writers get, when this thing happens, and New Yorker editing can get kind of intrusive sometimes, fussy. A lot of writers get defensive and they shut down and they do the bare minimum. John would always give you more, and I think that's what John Updike does as a writer all the time, is he gives you more.
Well, I can't improve on that recommendation. One of the things that is exciting about being an old-fashioned writer is that you see it in type, and it's like a new thing, and it's clean, and the type is beautiful in its own way, and their men have labored to put it into type, and so the wish to improve it, if you can, is quite strong. And some of the purest writing you do, is with a pencil on those proofs. Just it's like the scribes used to do. It's your handwriting, and it's thrilling. And of course, it's thrilling to have the intelligent intention of a reader like Chip, or Bill Maxwell, or any of the editors I had at the New Yorker. I didn't resent at any of their intentions. Really, once you got past the more or less house rules, under Sean, you had a fairly prudish approach to physical realities. I once tried to get the word penis into a story, and Sean got all kind of pink in the face and didn't want to discuss it, but he wouldn't allow it. And I said, or thought, I forget which, what do you call this thing? And there was no word, and Sean, out of... But other than that, that was a peculiarity. Maybe certainly Gottlieb, when as soon as he came in, changed all that, didn't he?
Could you talk about the planning of your novels? I'm very interested to know how much you know your characters before you begin, how much kind of note-taking you've done. Have you written little biographies of them? Have you done riffs in their voices before you start to write? And how much do you, I know Fitzgerald apparently had 3x5 cards. He had the whole novel planned out. How much of that do you do?
I try to begin, obviously, with I do like to have a title before I begin, because I think the title should be kind of woven into the fabric of the novel. I know titles are often given by an editor or by a passing stranger, but I try to have a title. I must know where I'm going to begin because I'm about to begin, and I must have some sense of where it's going to end. The middle, there's a curve of action and a few events you can predict, but as you say, you can't really predict everything a character or a set of characters is going to do from page to page. You sit down every day in the hopes that they will do something nice and that you can help them to do this thing to advance the story. I've never been one for long outlines, though occasionally, yes, it does help to write down an idea or a new thought about where a certain action might go. Sinclair Lewis, on the contrary, used to write little biographies of his characters, and they're kind of masterly and very full. They're almost more interesting than what he finally puts into the novel. But he was a researcher with a journalist's habits, and this for him was normal procedure. Babbitt is sort of put together out of observations, but also interviews. He talks to people. Writing about a doctor, he talks to doctors. So this was a little different than I do. Obviously, there is some research always. And what people do for profession is it's always a mystery to me, since I was a school teacher's son who became a writer very quickly. So, but yeah, I think your energy should go into the book. And I don't recommend keeping a journal, though many fine writers have kept journals. Cheever's journal certainly is in many ways fascinating. I mean, it's so distressing. But Edmund Wilson kept a copious journal, which he often drew upon. But I think, no, you have to, if you have that kind of energy. Thomas Mann kept a journal. But no, I try to put my energy into the artifact and not save the confession for some other book.
Mr. Updike, I'm a great admirer of your short stories. I have a collection called Hugging the Shore. I reread periodically. I'm sure you remember it. But I was fascinated to find out what triggers your ideas for the subjects you cover. Clearly, some of them might be a novel, but there are so many unique things that don't appear other places. I just wondered what prompted you to do those, or certain of them.
And let me add to it a question I've often wondered. When an idea comes along, do you know right off the bat that this is an idea for a novel or an idea for a story, or does it happen sometimes that what you think is a story becomes a novel and vice versa?
I've had short story ideas that became novels. Couples was a short story originally, but just to deal with a large number, not a large number, but even a sizable number of couples means you have to, all these names and everything, and I saw through the failed short story that this was a novel or nothing at all. On the other hand, some novel ideas just die so that they become perforce short stories. So no, you don't know exactly what form. And the gentleman asked me about ideas. I don't know. Ideas, a lot of them are things that happen to you or might have happened to you, or occasionally a news item even. Dostoevsky used to read the newspaper and write on it, and it's hard to say. But if you're a practicing writer, you're open to new ideas, and wherever they may occur. I've lost track of who's the B to the A team over
Mr.
there.
Updike, you touched upon the upcoming election. I'm just wondering if you could share some thoughts about it and who you might be supporting.
Well, I shouldn't broadcast my vote, but I've been a Democrat all my life, and my parents were Democrats. I think I'm an old-fashioned Democrat, actually, but a Democrat I am, and certainly never felt more comfortable with it than in this present election. My former governor, the Republican governor of Massachusetts, said of this election that he thought that Obama was a candidate, he's a once-in-a-lifetime candidate. And I thought that was pretty true. I've never, in my own lifetime, not since Adlai Stevenson, have I seen a so graceful and thoughtful a speaker, and so cool, and I think he set himself a very difficult task. Being a black man in America is not easy, and trying to run for president must be difficult, and he hasn't quite secured it yet. But I must say, I think he's a very impressive performer. Love him. Yes.
I wanted to prelude this by saying that I am a big fan of yours. But I was just wondering, what is your response to one of the more popular criticisms that your work from time to time can be lacking of character development?
Or let me add to it, the other criticism, as long as we're going to pile on.
Oh, how did I?
The other criticism is that it's the one that James Wood makes, that it's too much style, not enough matter.
Well, your tolerance for style, I think, varies, and I write in a way that I think is appropriate and suitably tuned to the subject matter. Sometimes it takes a certain number of words to describe with the correct shades and nuance what you want to say. The other one was the character development. To me, literature is not a parade of characters. The characters exist and should have a certain psychic bulk that makes them memorable and gives them life, and they should be consistent. But I've never really sat down and said, gee, I have a wonderful character here. It's more you try to deal with a predicament or a situation. Rabbit Run, I guess, became an interesting character, but really it was his predicament and him as a specimen human being full of conflicting desires that interested me. And it may be, it's possible that I haven't known enough people, or that I don't care enough about people, or that I write badly, as James Wood so helpfully points out. You have to try to be yourself, and you want to be your best self. But in the end, it has to be you who's signing it, and you who has to write in a way that you think is fresh and relevant. Yes, sir.
And I think this is going to be, unless there's someone over there, this is the last question.
He's the last, and he has a lovely white shirt. He's shining.
I'll go change it. But this is a somewhat related question, I think. It's about your book, The Centaur. In 1979, John Gardner wrote a short book called On Moral Fiction, in which he said that contemporary fiction had sort of lost its way, and it would become obsessed with technique, and the human struggles were sort of buried in the process. But he made 3 exceptions. It was Bellow, Malamud, and it was your book, The Centaur. Now, my question is, why would he have seized on that book, and does that book have a special place in your past of books?
It was my 3rd novel and was important to me and sits very fondly in my memory. It's a kind of a homage of a surreal sort to my father, and a description of a surreal sort of my boyhood, my adolescence, really. I didn't know Gardner liked anything I wrote, really, so I'm happy to hear that. I read the moral fiction, I read around in it, and I thought his early death did remove a real thinker from the fictional scene. I'm not sure he was always a good thinker, but he did bring great expectations to fiction. And that's important when it's so easy to dismiss fiction as made-up stuff to beguile a
Does this work have any chance of surviving or being revived or resurrected? They're now John Gardner stuff, but Sunlight Dialogues.
I think there are people. I think it's still in print, maybe not with a major imprint, but I think I've seen Grendel is a wonderful novel, and I believe that's always in print, and some of the later novels, too, have their admirers. But about the Centaur, I really wanted to say that for some time, being the son of a school teacher, I tried to write about high school as it was and as I saw it, the seethe of it, the multiplicity of the action. And it was always defeated me until I had this strange idea of really telling the story of Chiron, the head of the centaurs in Greek mythology, who died of a poisoned arrow. And somehow I could see my father as Chiron, and only through that particular scrim was I able to write about him and high school and a lot of other things that mattered to me. So in some ways it was a freakish book and was reviewed as a very unnecessary piece of foolery. But to me it was the only way I could write the book, and it was a way of unloading something very important to me, my father's humorous suffering. I guess is what it amounted to, and so I'm glad Gardner responded to it, and it is one of my favorite
It's a beautiful book.
novels. Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you all very much.
Thank you. You want to go?
Thank you.